Good morning. Today we're reading Matthew 21, verse 1 to 11. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there, with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. "Say to daughter Zion, see, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven." When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred, and they asked, "Who is this?" And the crowds answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee."
Well, good morning. It is great to be here on such a beautiful day. I hope that the sunshine and the banners give you a sense of celebration today for Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday is a weird kind of day, though, because it's full of celebration and it's full of cheering, but we also know where the story is about to go. We know what's going to happen in under a week to Jesus. We've already told you that the next 2 sermons are titled "The Crucified King" and "The Risen King." And so today we start off with the welcomed King, but we know that it's temporary. We know that what's happening for Jesus here in these scenes will not happen for much longer, and soon he will no longer be welcomed in Jerusalem. It's a weird kind of week, Palm Sunday. It's a weird kind of day, and I imagine it was strange for Jesus too. I used to enjoy watching a show. I don't know if any of you have watched it. I used to enjoy watching it. I don't think my mum liked it that much. Called Seconds from Disaster. Anybody familiar? Anybody watch Seconds from Disaster? No, it was a show about disasters, and they would explain to you how the disasters happened. Some of them natural disasters, some of them human error. It was a very grim show. It made you not want to ever get on an aeroplane again. The show would begin by conveying to you the disaster first. So they would show you the events of the disaster. They would show you the plane crash or the volcano eruption or whatever it was. They would start with that, and then they would spend the rest of the show explaining to you how this disaster built up, how it was possible this happened. The catchphrase of the show, the tagline that would play at the start is, "Disasters don't just happen. They are a chain of critical events. Unravel the fateful decisions in those final seconds from disaster." And so the show would spoil the ending for you first and then spend the rest of the time showing you how that could have happened. And so as you watched it, you couldn't help but feel frustrated. You couldn't help but feel angry at the decisions that were made. When a corner was cut in safety, you were like, "Why? I know what's going to happen because of this." When someone made a poor decision, a poor judgment call, when someone was not communicating as much as they should have, you found yourself frustrated by the events because you knew what the outcome was going to be. When we look at Palm Sunday, I think we get a similar feeling. We see the crowds cheering and praising Jesus, and yet for me, I find myself frustrated knowing what's about to happen, that this praise is so short-lived. Another example for my young people out there. It's like that trend, that video trend, the non-linear storytelling trend. I don't know if you guys have seen it. Yeah, I got a few. Yeah. You know, where there's a video that's played, and in the first couple of seconds, it'll snap across to the end of it, just for a couple of frames, and then snap back. And so you'll have someone who's sitting in front of a bottle of Coke. and you're watching them kind of pick up a Mentos, and then it'll cut from a moment to show an explosion in the face of the person, and then back to them talking about the Mentos. And then another frame of explosion, and then back to them finally putting it in. And so the punchline of the joke is revealed early, and the whole time you're waiting to see that punchline fulfilled. With Jesus, as we look at the triumphant entry, we get glimpses of the cross. We get moments where you can't help but see what's about to happen. And so I wouldn't blame you if, like me, you feel pretty somber reading the events of Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem. If you feel a little bit sad at the things that are happening. I'm sure Jesus had it on his mind as well. I'm sure Jesus knew the irony of this entrance. He knew what was about to happen. And so it changes the way we read this story entirely. We know that Jesus is aware because 3 times already in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus has already talked about the fact that he's going to die. In chapters 16, 17, and 20 of Matthew, Jesus has already predicted that he's going to die. That as he comes into Jerusalem, he is going to be killed by the religious leaders. So Jesus knows this, but none of his disciples get the message. They hear it, but they don't understand what Jesus is saying. And so in this whole crowd of celebration, perhaps the only person who knows what's really going to happen is Jesus. Perhaps the only person who sees the sadness and the somberness in this scene is Jesus. And so now we get to join with him in seeing that sadness and somberness too, as we explore this passage. Jesus is welcomed with incredible celebration. And the celebration isn't in vain. So let's dive in and have a look at what we learn about Jesus, our welcomed King, as he enters into Jerusalem. And the first thing we learn from this scene, the first thing we learn as we read this passage, this one's a little bit obscure, is we learn that Jesus is a bold king. And this is not a thing that we often say about Jesus. In fact, more often than not, Jesus is more of a secret king than a bold king. Jesus is more of a quiet king than one who is upfront, showing off who he is. He's quite private about the nature of his ministry. When Jesus heals a man with leprosy in Matthew chapter 7, afterwards he turns to him and he says, "See that you do not tell anyone." And instead he tells him to go and present himself to the priests. Or when Jesus is declared as the Messiah by Peter, he says to Peter and the disciples, it says he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he is the Messiah. Jesus very rarely proclaims who he is to the people. More often than not, he tells them not to tell others who he is. Jesus opts to let people make up their own mind about him. Rather than outright tell them who he is, he lets them make that decision for themselves. But that's not the whole reason why Jesus doesn't proclaim it. It's not just for the sake of freedom of choice. In fact, the greater reason that Jesus often kept his ministry a secret was because he knew that the sooner that people grasped who he was and who he was claiming to be, the sooner they would have to draw their battle lines. Once it became clear that Jesus was claiming to be the Messiah, the coming King, the Son of God himself, the people would have to make a decision, whether they would side with Jesus or silence Jesus. And so the events of Matthew 21 feel a little out of character for Jesus. We're not used to him being bold in proclaiming who he is. But in verse 1 of our passage, we read that as they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there, with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me." The trek that Jesus had taken already to get to Jerusalem was over 100 kilometers. He'd been walking for a couple of days at this point most likely. And you might think that Jesus is getting a little bit tired. The ascent up to Jerusalem was quite an uphill battle. But we know that Jesus loved to walk, or at least it was his preferred method of transportation. In fact, in our Gospels, he almost exclusively walks everywhere. The only exceptions to Jesus walking are the times that he takes a boat across the lake. And in one of those times, he walks most of the way anyway on the water. Jesus loves to walk. It's all he does. And so it's very strange for him to send his disciples to get him a mount to ride into town. It's a very odd thing for him to do. But he requests his disciples to fetch him this donkey for him to ride. And I don't think it's because he's fatigued. I don't think it's because he's tired. He sends it for a specific reason, and we read what that reason is in verse 4. In verse 4 we read, "This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet." Jesus sends for this donkey because he needs to fulfill a prophecy, to show who he is. That's why when he sends the disciples to fetch this donkey, they are to say that the Lord needs the donkey. Some people would say that it's Jesus who is the Lord who needs it. Some people would say it's God who is the Lord who needs it. Either way, God does need this donkey to fulfill a prophecy. And so Jesus fetches this donkey with intention. He knows what he's doing. He's aware that in riding this donkey, he is making a declaration of who he is. Like way back at the start of Jesus' ministry, when he goes into the synagogue and he reads a prophetic passage about the Messiah, and then he says, "This is fulfilled in your presence, in me," Jesus is making a bold declaration of who he is, that he is a king. Jesus is not tired, he is ready. He is ready to declare who he is. And so this prophecy that Jesus needed to fulfill, we read it in verse 5 in Matthew. It's a quotation from Zechariah 9, verse 9. And it says, "Say to daughter Zion, see your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The king needs a donkey. As he rides into Jerusalem, he needs a donkey to declare that he is the king. In some circumstances, a traveler could ride a donkey without it meaning much. It is something that would be ridden when people were weary. But when Jesus rides this donkey, he's being deliberately provocative. He's being deliberate in declaring who he is. And the crowd around him gets it. The crowd around him understand that something is going on here, that he is making a declaration. And so they start celebrating. They start praising him with these words that are around the auditorium here. They're cheering and they're shouting because they know that Jesus is saying something, even without saying words. As he is seated a little higher than the crowd on a donkey, he is elevated above them. A rare thing for Jesus to do. Riding a donkey had long been a sign of kingship. To ride a donkey meant you were a ruler of some kind. Many of the judges rode donkeys, and the people who judged alongside them rode donkeys. When David's sons were having a dispute over who would succeed the throne from him, David puts his son Solomon on a donkey and rides him towards his coronation to declare, "This is my heir. This is the one who will take the throne after me." So when Jesus gets on a donkey for the first time in his ministry, and when he rides higher than the crowds who are walking into Jerusalem, he is declaring, "I am the heir. I am the king. I will take David's throne. Recognize me." It's a bold thing for Jesus to do, and a rare thing for Jesus to do in his earthly ministry. So the people see this Jesus. He's elevated on a donkey. He's riding into the city of Jerusalem, the place where David's throne is and was established. And they praise and they celebrate because their king has finally come. And for once, Jesus doesn't rebuke them. He doesn't tell them, "Be quiet. I don't want people to know." No, he intends for people to recognize him. There's no secret anymore. There's no being quiet about it. Jesus is entering into Jerusalem boldly as their king. He accepts their celebration, and he accepts his title as king. Jesus finally welcomes the public recognition of who he is. He is not hiding. The praise he receives, he deserves. For those who have begun to realize who Jesus is, they can't help but praise and acknowledge that he is their king. He is the Son of David coming into the holy city itself. In the Gospel of Luke, we even see that the Pharisees, they try to rebuke the people for praising Jesus in this way. And Jesus says, I tell you, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. Jesus is accepting praise. He is accepting worship, and he's doing it publicly and boldly. This is the praise Jesus always deserved. And as he enters into Jerusalem, he enters as a king, boldly announcing his intention to take his place as the King of the Jews. Jesus is a bold king, no longer quiet. He is ready to take his place as their king. He's more than a bold king, though. And so as we keep on reading, we start to see that this may sound like a contradiction, but Jesus isn't just bold, he is also humble. They may sound like opposites, but they're not here. Because Jesus is finally willing to accept the praise and accept the worship and accept the recognition of who he is. But there's a great irony in the praise of the people. It's like in movies or the kind of the joke punchline where people say, is anybody here a doctor? And someone says, I'm a doctor. And then they realize they're a doctor of philosophy. The people are calling for one kind of king, and Jesus comes as a different kind of king. He's not the king they're expecting. He's not even the king that they're asking for, but he is the king that they desperately need. Jesus is a far better king than the people could have ever asked for, even if he is a humble one. And so here's where we really start to see the dissonance that Jesus must have been experiencing on this day. Because the people are praising him as this mighty king, this incredible king, and yet he knows the kind of king that he actually is and that he actually intends to be. The people laud him as king. They expect him to come and deliver them from Roman oppression, to deliver them from the people who rule over them, to establish Israel and Jerusalem as a powerful nation again under the full blessing of God. They expect extravagant power to be displayed. If the king who is in the line of David is returning to Jerusalem, that means Jerusalem and Israel are about to become top dog again. All is going to be well for them. And so they're praising this mighty king. But we see that the hearts of the people and the heart of Jesus are misaligned. If we turn back to that quote from Zechariah, we'll turn to actually Zechariah this time, not Matthew's version of it. In Zechariah 9, verses 9 to 10, we read the full passage that's being quoted. And it says this: Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. I will take away the chariots from Ephraim and the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations. Zechariah as a book is full of war imagery, full of battles and of kings, full of God's strength and might being shown. But the passage that we're given is a moment of peace. It's a moment where the fighting and the war stops. Though the king is arriving and though he is claimed to be righteous and victorious, we see that the way that he achieved this victory is not through violent means. He arrives on a donkey. Not extravagant and powerful, not in shining armor and with a sword in hand. He's a king who is arriving, but he is lowly and riding on a donkey. He's a humble king, not a proud one. He is victorious, but not through violence. We see that further in the fact that the king arrives not on a war horse, a typical symbol of strength and might and power, but on a donkey, a typical symbol of peace. Donkeys are not built for war. They are built for travel. They are reliable, sturdy, and headstrong. Those who ride donkeys bring peace, not war. And so Zechariah 9 verse 10 ends with the phrase, "He will proclaim peace to the nations." Peace, not only for Israel, but for the whole world. Not only for Israel, but for Rome too. The people they want to see conquered, Jesus proclaims peace to them as well. And so while Jesus is being bold in declaring that he is a king, as he accepts his title, he enters as a humble and lowly king. A king riding on a donkey who did not come to bring peace with a sword and bow and war horse, but peace with God through a cross, through nails, and through a donkey. The people are praising a king, but Jesus offers a correction to the kind of king he is going to be. The people shout, "Hosanna," as Jesus enters Jerusalem. Hosanna, a phrase that we read it from the Psalm, a phrase that means save or save us. But at this point in time, it wasn't used to say save anymore. It was just a phrase you would use in praise and exaltation, a phrase of excitement. It's not a request to be saved, but a declaration of praise to God already. Their words are full of excitement, but Jesus knew that what they were asking for would come at great cost. For Jesus to truly save, he had to die. Again, we see this. The people placed their cloaks on the ground for Jesus to walk over. This is hearkening back to a passage in 2 Kings. There's a new king who has just been appointed and anointed. And we read in 2 Kings 9:13 that the people respond by quickly taking their cloaks off, and they spread them under him on the bare steps. And then they blew the trumpet and shouted, "Jehu is king." Well, here, it's not Jehu who is being anointed as king, but Jesus who is king. And Jesus knows that it's not the people's cloaks that need to be removed, but it's his. That soon he will be stripped and beaten and crucified. We see it again when the people shout, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord," a phrase that means that the one who walks in the will of God, the one who follows God, brings blessing with them. But Jesus knows that in just a few days, he will be weeping in a garden as he struggles to take on the will that God has for him. That to come in the name of the Lord means he needs to die for the sake of the Lord. Jesus may be entering Jerusalem as king, but he's not the kind of king that they're expecting. He is bold, but he is humble. He is seated highly on a donkey, but he is lowly in heart. He is honored today, but in less than a week, he will be shamed. Praised now, but soon to wear the curse of sin. Jesus is not the king the people expected, but he is the one they desperately needed. And so the final thing that we learn about the kind of king that Jesus is as he enters into Jerusalem is that he is a divisive king. That much should be obvious to us. Anybody who can one day enter with praise and shouts of worship and then a few days later be killed seems like a pretty divisive figure. But there's something about these passages that I think is often left out. And even in that video we just watched, I think is a little ambiguous. So I'm going to inform you of something. We've often heard it said that the same crowd who worshipped Jesus on Palm Sunday crucified Jesus on Good Friday. And that's maybe true. Somewhat true. We know that many of the disciples deserted Jesus. We know that at least one of them rejected Jesus in Peter, probably more as well. I'm sure there were people who did reject Jesus and who were okay with his crucifixion. But we actually read in this passage and the other ones that the crowd who is praising Jesus is not the people from Jerusalem, but the people who come with him into Jerusalem. The very large crowd in verse 8 the other Gospels shed more light on. In Luke, verse 19, we read that it is the whole crowd of disciples who began joyfully to praise God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. So it's the disciples who walk with Jesus who are praising him. In the Gospel of Mark, it's the crowd who are in front of him and behind him, the pilgrims coming into Jerusalem who are saying, Hosanna, welcome to the King, not the people from Jerusalem. It's only in the Gospel of John that we get any idea that it's the people of Jerusalem. And even there, it's predominantly the people who had already seen Jesus raise Lazarus. Lazarus was in Bethany, a town that's basically exactly where Jesus is in Bethphage. And so it's the people who had already seen that miracle or heard of that miracle who come out to meet him. Jerusalem itself doesn't know what to think. And so that's why in verses 10 and 11 we read that there's this contrast between the city and the crowds. The city speaks to the crowds and the crowds responds to the city. They're not the same people. So the people who worship Jesus as he enters Jerusalem are not necessarily the same crowd who crucify him in a few days. And we read in verse 10, when Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred, and they asked, "Who is this?" This is not the first time that Jerusalem has been stirred. It's also not the last time. This word stirred carries with it a connotation of being shaken. The city is stirred and shaken. They're bewildered by what's happening. They don't know what to think. The first time that we read that the city of Jerusalem was stirred is way back in Matthew chapter 2. We read that it was Herod and Jerusalem who were stirred. They were troubled by the news that Jesus had been born and that he was to be King of the Jews. When Jesus was born, it was the Magi, who declared that the King of the Jews has been born, and Jerusalem and Herod were stirred, troubled. Then here, when Jesus enters into the city as the king that he was already proclaimed to be, the city is stirred again. They're shaken by the news. But it goes further than that. When Jesus is crucified, as he breathes his last breath, we read in Matthew 27:51 that at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook. The rocks split and the tombs broke open. Jesus' death shakes Jerusalem physically now. And in the very next chapter, as the two Marys head to Jesus' tomb, expecting to find him lying there, in chapter 28, verse 2, we read that there was a violent earthquake. For an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and going to the tomb rolled back the stone and sat on it. Again, Jerusalem is shaken. 4 times Jerusalem is shaken. Twice metaphorically, twice physically. When Jesus is declared as king, when he enters as king, they are shaken in their hearts. And then as he dies and rises again, they are physically shaken by that. Jesus shakes the people. He stirs them. He challenges them. He's dividing them, calling them to make a decision. What is happening is substantial enough to shake the whole city, and they have to make a decision about whether they will receive it or not. And so they're stirred, and they ask the crowds who are praising Jesus, "Who is this Jesus?" And the crowds respond in verse 11, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." Feels a bit like they missed the point. You expect them to say he's the king, and they say he's the prophet. Maybe they didn't quite get it right, and I'm sure they haven't figured it out yet. But this is still a pretty big claim about Jesus, about who Jesus is. They clearly have recognized him as king based on what they've been shouting already. But when they're asked who he is, they call him the prophet. The prophet who was prophesied in Deuteronomy, who would come and be one of the people, but bring the word of God. Who would be like the people, but would speak the very words of God. A great prophet, the great prophet. But we're not told whether Jerusalem accepts this answer. I suspect they don't, since in a few days' time they will be crucifying him. Jesus came as a bold and humble king, but his presence divided the people. Some saw him as a king, others as a threat. Some as a prophet, others as a heretic. Some as a man to be praised, others as a man to be killed. Jesus has always been a divisive king. He is bold enough to tell us who he really is. He makes it pretty clear. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. Jesus declares that he is the only king, the only one worthy of praise, the only way. He boldly says this to us so that there is no mistaking who he is. But he's also humble enough to lay down his life for us, to die on our behalf, choosing not violence, but peace, not pride, but humility. Peace to all nations if they would accept it. But he is divisive. He offers peace and forgiveness and the source of love itself, but many will still reject him. They are shaken, but not changed, stirred, but not convinced. But for those who are convinced that Jesus is king, they shout, "Save us, Hosanna." And it's not a shout of shame and rejection, but a shout of praise at what God is about to do. As we shout Hosanna, as we join in that praise, we know that God has saved us, that our King has saved us, that he has come to bring peace between us and God, and that he chose to do that through humility, not strength. Jesus didn't arrive on a war horse, but arrived on a donkey to bring us peace with God. Our bold and humble King has come to claim his throne, to show his power over everything. And he invites us to respond with the same praise as the people, with joy and praise, with worship. On this Palm Sunday, on this beautiful day, Jesus invites us to worship him and praise him because though he was humble and lowly and crucified, that his forgiveness and his love is shown through his humility. That he enters Jerusalem victorious, not in spite of the cross, but because of the cross. We celebrate with all the disciples who walk into Jerusalem on this day because our King has arrived. Our King is here, that he brings peace, that he brings freedom, that he brings forgiveness. The cross did not stop Jesus' reign. If anything, it started his new reign in our lives.